My name is Evelyn Harper. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my life, I've been described with words that sound kind, but always felt incomplete. Quiet, responsible, the one who doesn't cause trouble. I'm a project coordinator by trade, the kind of job where you keep everything running smoothly while someone else takes the credit for the outcome. And that's fitting, because that's also how I existed inside my family for a very long time. People tend to underestimate me, not because I'm incapable, but because I don't rush to explain myself. I don't raise my voice. I don't interrupt. I learned early that silence made others comfortable, and that comfort often came at my expense. When you're calm, people assume you're unaffected. When you're patient, they assume you're fine with whatever they decide. This story isn't about shouting or revenge, or proving someone wrong in a dramatic moment. It's about what happens when a single lie reshapes an entire family's understanding of who you are, and how long the echo of that lie can last. Years ago, my parents believed my siblings' version of events over mine. It wasn't one explosive accusation. It was something quieter than that, something easier to accept. A story that positioned them as disappointed, confused, and justified, and me as difficult, distant, and ultimately disposable. They cut me off emotionally first, then practically, then entirely. And for a long time, I let that be the end of it. This narrative is not about how I won. It's about how I survived being misunderstood without turning bitter, about how truth doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it waits, sometimes it documents itself, sometimes it sits unnoticed until the people who dismissed you are forced to sit with the consequences of their certainty. What you'll hear is not a tale of villains and heroes. Everyone in this story believed they were acting reasonably at the time. That's what makes it harder and more real. I'm not sharing this to shame my family or to reopen wounds for sympathy. I'm sharing it because emotional injustice often looks invisible from the outside. Because many people listening may recognize the role I was assigned long before they ever questioned it. There is no sudden miracle in this story, no dramatic courtroom scene, no screaming confrontation that changes everything in one afternoon. The shift happens slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day the truth surfaces, and no one knows what to say. I'll walk you through who I was to them, how the narrative was built, why I stayed silent, and what finally changed. Not with anger, not with cruelty, just with clarity. If you've ever been misunderstood by the people who were supposed to know you best, have you ever wondered what they actually saw when they looked at you? In my family, I was never the problem, but I was never the priority either. I was the one who adjusted, the one who remembered birthdays without needing reminders, the one who showed up early, stayed late, and filled the gaps without being asked. If there was tension in the room, I softened it. If there was confusion, I clarified it. If there was disappointment, I absorbed it quietly and moved on. My parents liked to say I was easy. What they meant was that I didn't demand space. Growing up, my sibling took up most of the emotional oxygen. They were expressive, reactive, and persuasive. When they were hurt, everyone knew it. When they were angry, it was addressed immediately. When they told a story, it came with emotion. And emotion, I learned early, often passes for truth. I was the contrast, calm, measured, careful with words. At family gatherings, I was the one asked to help in the kitchen while conversations happened elsewhere. Not because I was excluded intentionally, but because no one thought I'd mind. And I didn't. At least, not out loud. When decisions were made, I was informed, not consulted. When opinions were shared, mine was treated as an afterthought. Evelyn's flexible, my mother would say. She understands. And I did understand, just not in the way they assumed. Understanding, for me, didn't mean agreement. It meant observation. I noticed how often my silence was interpreted as consent. How rarely anyone checked whether I was okay with the roles assigned to me. I noticed how my reliability became expected, then invisible. The better I handled things, the less acknowledgement there was that I was handling anything at all. If something went wrong, it was quietly redirected toward me. Not blamed. That would have required confrontation, but implied. A look, a pause, a subtle shift in tone. Enough to suggest I should be more careful next time, even when no one could quite explain what I'd done wrong. And still I stayed. Part of that was loyalty. Part of it was habit. And part of it was the unspoken rule I'd internalized. Don't make things harder for everyone else. I told myself that families aren't fair systems, that love isn't measured in attention, that being needed was its own kind of value. I told myself that if I just stayed consistent, stayed reasonable, stayed calm, things would eventually balance out. But balance requires weight on both sides. To them, I was dependable background noise, a constant presence that didn't require maintenance. I wasn't fragile, so I wasn't protected. I wasn't loud, so I wasn't heard. I wasn't dramatic, so I wasn't believed to be deeply affected by anything. They thought they knew me. They thought I didn't mind being overlooked because I didn't protest. They thought I didn't hurt because I didn't show it. They thought my restraint meant I was untouched by conflict. What they never asked was why I was so careful. There's a particular loneliness that comes with being seen as the strong one. It means your pain doesn't register as urgent. It means your version of events feels optional. It means that when two stories are presented, one emotional, one composed, the emotional one often wins. And so, without anyone explicitly saying it, I became the person whose perspective could be adjusted, whose memories were flexible, whose intentions were always assumed to be good, but whose impact was questioned anyway. I didn't resent my family then. I didn't think of myself as wronged. I simply believed my role was to keep things stable, even if that meant standing slightly outside the center of the picture. I didn't know yet that stability, when built on silence, is fragile. And I didn't know that one day, the way they saw me, calm, reasonable, unreactive, would become the very reason my truth would be dismissed when it mattered most. At the time, I just thought I was being mature. I didn't realize I was being positioned. The first real cut wasn't loud enough to bleed. That's how these things usually start. Not with betrayal, but with something small enough to dismiss if you're motivated to keep the peace. It happened over something trivial. A family situation that should have ended in a shrug. A misunderstanding involving money and timing, nothing dramatic. I had agreed to handle an errand that involved my sibling, picking up documents they needed for a personal matter. The plan changed at the last minute, and no one told me. I arrived, realized the mistake, and left. When my parents asked later what happened, I explained it simply. No accusation, no defensiveness, just facts. But my sibling had already spoken to them. Their version came with frustration, with emphasis, with the subtle implication that I had been careless, that I hadn't followed through, that they'd been inconvenienced because I didn't take it seriously. It wasn't a lie in the obvious sense, it was worse than that. It was a framing. When my parents responded, I noticed something shift, not anger, something colder, a mild disappointment that landed squarely on me. My mother asked if I double-checked the details. My father suggested that I might have been distracted. Their questions weren't neutral, they already assumed the shape of the answer. I corrected them, gently. I explained the timeline again. They nodded. Then my mother said, "Well, your sibling was really upset." And just like that, the conversation ended. No conclusion, no clarification. Just an emotional weight placed on one side of the scale and left there. I remember thinking, that was strange, not painful, not alarming, just off. A few days later, I overheard my father on the phone. He didn't know I was in the room. He was retelling the incident to a relative, casually mentioning that I'd dropped the ball a bit and that my sibling had been under a lot of stress. I didn't interrupt. I told myself it wasn't worth correcting, that it would sound defensive, that would make things awkward. I told myself it didn't matter. But something in me noted it anyway, quietly, like a line drawn in pencil. That was the first time I realized how easily a narrative could be shaped when I wasn't in the room, and how quickly my role as the reliable one could be reinterpreted as the negligent one, without anyone feeling like they were being unfair. After that, similar moments began to appear, small comments, side glances, a slight hesitation before trusting me with something. Nothing explicit enough to challenge directly, just enough to suggest that my dependability was no longer assumed. It had to be evaluated. And every time, my siblings' emotions were the justification. They were really stressed. They didn't mean it that way. You know how sensitive they are. Sensitivity, I learned, can become a shield. It excuses exaggeration. It softens accountability. It reframes reaction as truth. Meanwhile, my calmness became a liability. Because I didn't react strongly, it seemed like I wasn't affected. Because I didn't push back hard, it appeared that I accepted the implication. Because I didn't escalate, it looked like an agreement. I tried once to address it directly. I said to my mother, "I feel like sometimes my side doesn't fully land." She sighed, not in irritation, in fatigue. "You're overthinking," she said. "No one's against you." And that was that. No one was against me. But no one was standing with me either. From then on, I started noticing how often things were explained to me rather than with me. How frequently my intentions were interpreted through someone else's feelings. How quickly a story became settled without my input. That first small cut didn't hurt because of what it was. It hurt because of what it revealed. That when two versions of a story exist, one emotional, one composed, the emotional one is often accepted as more real. And I had just learned which side I was on. Once the first cut healed without acknowledgement, it became easier for the next ones to go unnoticed. That's how normalization works. Nothing changes all at once. You just adapt, quietly, until what once would have felt unacceptable becomes routine. After that incident, my role shifted in subtle ways. Requests came with assumptions attached. If something went wrong, explanations were delivered to me in a tone that suggested correction rather than conversation. I was still trusted, technically, but with an undercurrent of scrutiny that hadn't been there before. If I noticed and pulled back, no one commented. If I compensated by being extra thorough, no one thanked me. The new standard was simply more care, more proof, more effort to earn the same baseline trust I'd once had automatically, and I accepted it, partly because challenging it would have required naming something intangible. You can't confront a pattern that hasn't been acknowledged yet. You can't argue against a feeling someone else is having about you without being accused of invalidating them. So I stayed quiet. I told myself I was being mature. Families go through phases. That my sibling was under pressure and needed grace. That my parents were just trying to keep the peace. Every excuse I made for them was another reason not to make space for myself. The disrespect wasn't overt. It was procedural. Plans changed without informing me. Then I was asked why I hadn't adjusted. Conversations about me happened in rooms I wasn't invited into. Decisions that affected me were framed as already settled by the time I heard about them. When I expressed confusion, I was told I'd misunderstood. When I expressed discomfort, I was told I was being sensitive, a word that had never been used on me before, but now appeared conveniently when I questioned anything. The irony wasn't lost on me. I watched how my siblings' emotional reactions continued to shape outcomes. If they were upset, the room bent around them. If I was hurt, the room went quiet, then moved on. And slowly, without realizing it, I began to participate in my own erasure. I stopped offering explanations unless asked. I stopped correcting small inaccuracies. I stopped volunteering details that might complicate the story already forming. It felt easier to let things slide than to constantly reassert my version of reality. I learned to choose my words carefully, to preempt misunderstandings by over-clarifying, to document things just in case, even though I told myself I'd never need it. Still, I stayed, because leaving would have felt dramatic. And I had been trained, implicitly, that drama was the worst possible offense. So instead, I adapted. I became quieter, more efficient, less visible. And the more invisible I became, the easier it was for others to project onto me, to assume my motives, to fill in gaps with their own interpretations, to talk about me as if I were a fixed concept rather than a present person. At some point, I realized that my parents had stopped asking how I felt about things entirely, not because they didn't care, but because they believed they already knew. "You're fine with it," my mother would say, as a statement, not a question. And I would nod, because correcting her would require admitting that I wasn't fine, and I didn't trust what would happen if I did. That's the quiet cost of normalized disrespect. It doesn't explode. It compresses. It teaches you to shrink your needs to fit the space you're allowed, to prioritize harmony over honesty, to treat your own discomfort as negotiable. I didn't feel angry then. I felt tired. Tired of calibrating myself. Tired of explaining without being heard. Tired of feeling like my role was to absorb, not to be understood. But I told myself it was temporary, that eventually things would reset. That if I stayed consistent long enough, the truth would become obvious on its own. I believed that being reasonable would protect me. I didn't yet understand that reasonableness, without boundaries, can be repurposed as permission, and that once disrespect is normalized, it stops looking like mistreatment and starts looking like your personality. Roles in families are rarely announced. They emerge quietly through repetition, expectation, and reward. By the time I noticed mine, it had already solidified. I was the reliable one, the capable one, the one who could be counted on not to make things worse. That last part mattered most. When something needed to be handled delicately, it came to me. When there was tension between others, I was asked to smooth it over. When my sibling reacted emotionally, I was expected to be understanding. When my parents felt overwhelmed, I was the pressure valve. And in return, I was granted neutrality, not support, not protection, just the assumption that I could handle it. The role worked because I played it well. I didn't demand reassurance. I didn't require follow-up. I didn't ask for apologies when something felt unfair. I absorbed discomfort quietly and converted it into functionality. To my parents, this looked like strength. To my sibling, it looked like availability. To me, it felt like being permanently on call, emotionally, mentally, logistically, without ever being considered vulnerable enough to warrant care. I noticed that when conflict arose, the outcome was often framed around who needed more accommodation. And it was never me. "You're more level-headed," my father would say. "You don't take things personally," my mother would add. "You understand how they are." Those phrases became the scaffolding of my role. Each one sounded like a compliment. Together, they formed a quiet expectation. You will bend because you can. And I did. I handled logistics. I remembered details. I followed through when others dropped the ball. I adjusted my schedule, my tone, my expectations, all in service of keeping things functional. What I didn't do was ask who was keeping me in mind, because the role didn't include that. Once during a family discussion that had already been decided without me, I said said carefully, "I wish I'd been part of that conversation." There was a pause, not uncomfortable, just brief. My mother said, "We didn't think you'd mind." That sentence did more than any argument could have. Because it confirmed what I'd suspected, my feelings were no longer something to be checked. They were something to be assumed. From then on, my absence from decisions wasn't seen as exclusion. It was framed as efficiency. Why involve me when I'd probably agree anyway? And if I didn't agree, that was positioned as unexpected, disruptive, inconvenient. So I learned to read the room before speaking, to sense which responses would be welcomed and which would be quietly corrected later. I learned that disagreement required emotional capital, and mine was already being spent elsewhere. My sibling, meanwhile, was allowed complexity. Their reactions were contextualized. Their mistakes were softened by explanations. Their words carried weight because they carried feeling. Mine carried logic, and logic, I learned, doesn't move people when emotion has already decided the outcome. I wasn't angry about the role at first. I was proud of it. Proud to be trusted. Proud to be capable. Proud to be the one who could be relied on when things got messy. It took time to realize that the role didn't just define how others treated me, it defined what they believed I deserved. Support became conditional. Understanding became optional. And my perspective became something to consult only if it didn't complicate things. By the time the lie that would fracture everything arrived, the groundwork had already been laid. I had been positioned as the one whose story could be adjusted. Because I was strong enough to handle it, the shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no raised voice, no accusation, no dramatic moment that would later be replayed in my head. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in a quiet space, when I was completely alone. I was sitting at my kitchen table, sorting through old paperwork, bills, warranties, notes I'd kept out of habit more than necessity. The kind of task that requires just enough attention to keep your hands busy while your mind wanders. I don't remember what triggered it. Maybe it was a comment from my mother earlier that week. Maybe it was the way my sibling's name had come up again in a conversation that had nothing to do with them. Or maybe it was simply accumulation, the slow weight of years finally reaching a threshold. I found myself thinking, when was the last time anyone asked me what I wanted? Not rhetorically, literally. I tried to answer it honestly, I couldn't. That realization landed heavier than I expected. Not painful, clarifying. I looked around my apartment. The furniture I'd chosen was neutral. The calendar was filled with obligations that weren't entirely mine. The routines I'd built around availability rather than preference. I realized that I had become very good at managing other people's expectations, and very bad at interrogating my own. And then another thought followed, quieter but sharper. What happens if I stop? Not dramatically, not with a confrontation, just if I stop compensating. The idea made me uncomfortable, which told me everything I needed to know. Discomfort, I'd learned, was the signal I'd been ignoring. I thought about the small cuts, the uncorrected stories, the assumptions that had solidified into truth without my consent, the way my silence had been interpreted as agreement again and again. And for the first time, I didn't feel obligated to explain it away. I didn't feel angry, I felt alert. That night, instead of calling my parents as I usually did, I didn't announce it. I didn't make a point of it. I just let the day end without reaching out. No one noticed. That too was information. Over the next few weeks, I made tiny adjustments. I didn't volunteer to mediate. I didn't preemptively clarify misunderstandings that didn't involve me directly. I answered questions when asked, but I stopped filling in the gaps. It felt strange, like leaving a door unlocked on purpose, like not bracing for impact that might not come. And something interesting happened. Nothing. The world didn't collapse. No one panicked. No one rushed in to ask if I was okay. The systems I'd been holding together wobbled slightly, then reconfigured without me. I watched it with a kind of detached curiosity. That's when I understood something fundamental. My silence had never been about peace. It had been about maintenance. And maintenance, when performed by only one person, is invisible until it stops. I started paying attention in a different way. Not to anticipate needs, but to observe dynamics. Who stepped in when I didn't? Who felt inconvenienced? Who noticed the absence of my quiet labor? And who didn't? I noticed how quickly my sibling filled the space with explanation when something went wrong, how my parents defaulted to soothing them, how no one reached out to ask why I wasn't smoothing things over anymore. And I realized that the role I'd been playing wasn't just expected, it was relied upon, which meant it could be withdrawn, not as punishment, not as leverage, as truth. That was the day something shifted. Not in my family, in me. I stopped believing that being reasonable would eventually earn fairness. I started believing that clarity required distance. And for the first time, I understood that silence wasn't just something that happened to me. It was something I could choose. Once silence stopped being automatic, it changed texture. Before, it had been reflexive. A habit formed from years of smoothing, yielding, adjusting. Now, it has become intentional, measured, selective. I didn't announce this shift to anyone. I didn't need to. The point wasn't to provoke a reaction. The point was to see what existed when I wasn't constantly filling the space. At first, people mistook my quiet for availability. My siblings still assumed I'd step in if something went sideways. My parents still spoke as if I were in agreement with decisions made elsewhere. Invitations still arrived with the expectation that I'd adapt. But when I didn't, when I simply responded with, "I won't be able to help with that," or "I'll need more time to think about it," the reactions were revealing. There was confusion, mild surprise, occasionally irritation, not because I was being unreasonable, but because I was no longer predictable. Predictability had been my currency, and without it, the system had to recalibrate. I noticed how often people interpreted my boundaries as personal commentary. A pause became a judgment. A neutral response became distant. My refusal to immediately accommodate was quietly reframed as withdrawal. No one asked what had changed. They simply filled in the story themselves. That's when I understood how narratives function in families like mine. When someone steps out of their assigned role, the explanation isn't curiosity, it's correction. "You seem different lately," my mother said once, carefully. "I'm just busy," I replied, which was true, but not the whole truth. I wasn't ready to articulate the rest yet, because articulating it would invite negotiation, and I wasn't interested in negotiating my awareness away. Instead, I listened. I listened to how often my siblings spoke about me when I wasn't present, how my absence from certain tasks was framed as Evelyn didn't want to be involved, rather than Evelyn wasn't asked. I listened to how my parents repeated those explanations without question, and quietly I began to document, not in anticipation of confrontation, but in defense of clarity. Dates, messages, emails, changes in plans, versions of events that shifted depending on who was telling them. I didn't correct them in real time, I simply recorded them. This wasn't a strategy yet, it was grounding. I needed something solid, something external. Because when your internal experience has been repeatedly reframed by others, you learn not to rely on memory alone. Silence in this phase was misunderstood as weakness. I could feel it in the way my sibling became bolder in their interpretations. In the way my parents spoke more freely about me in my presence, assuming I wouldn't push back. They weren't trying to hurt me, they were responding to precedent. I had taught them what to expect. And now I was teaching them something else. There's a particular discomfort that comes with watching people misinterpret your restraint. The urge to clarify is strong, almost physical, but I resisted it, because clarity given too early is often dismissed. Instead, I focused on alignment, on making sure my actions matched my values, even if the perception lagged behind. I stopped rescuing conversations, stopped explaining tone, stopped translating intention. If someone misunderstood me now, I let the misunderstanding exist. That was new. And in that space, something else began to form, not externally, but internally. Confidence, not the performative kind. The quiet kind that comes from knowing you're no longer betraying yourself to maintain peace. I still cared about my family. That hadn't changed. But I was no longer willing to contort myself into a shape that made their lives easier at the expense of my own coherence. Silence had become a tool, not to punish, not to manipulate, but to observe without interference. And what it revealed was undeniable. Without my constant calibration, the stories about me grew less accurate and more convenient. That was when I understood that if the truth were ever going to matter, it would have to stand on something firmer than my willingness to explain it. What they never noticed was not my silence. It was what I was doing inside it. From the outside, it probably looked like I had receded. Less involved, less responsive, less present. And in a way, that was true, but only socially. Internally, I had never been more attentive. When you stop performing a role, you regain bandwidth. Energy that once went into managing reactions becomes available for observation. And I began to see patterns with a clarity I hadn't allowed myself before. I noticed how often my siblings spoke in absolutes, how their stories sharpened with each retelling, how details that didn't support their position quietly disappeared over time. I noticed how confidently they spoke on my behalf, what I meant, what I felt, what I was probably thinking. And I noticed how readily my parents accepted those interpretations, not because they were malicious, but because they were familiar. My siblings' emotional certainty felt convincing. My restraint, by contrast, felt ambiguous. I stopped trying to compete with that. Instead, I paid attention to the mechanics of it. I began to notice discrepancies, not dramatic ones, but small inconsistencies. Dates that didn't align, messages that contradicted later claims, situations where responsibility quietly shifted in the retelling. So I started keeping everything. Not obsessively, not anxiously, methodically. I saved emails instead of deleting them. I archived text messages. I kept calendar entries intact, even when plans changed. I wrote down summaries of conversations while they were still fresh, not interpretations, just what was said, by whom, and when. At first, it felt unnecessary, almost paranoid. I told myself I was being cautious, not suspicious. But over time, something unexpected happened. The fog lifted. When you've been subtly gaslit, not through outright lies, but through constant reframing, you start doubting your own recall. Documentation restores orientation. It gives you a reference point that isn't influenced by tone or memory or emotion. I began to trust myself again. And with that trust came patience. I didn't confront my sibling when their version of events shifted. I didn't challenge my parents when they repeated those versions. I simply noted it, added it to the record. I also noticed something else. No one was checking my version anymore. They assumed it hadn't changed. That assumption worked in my favor. Because while they believed the narrative was static, I was quietly building context. I learned more about family dynamics in those months than I had in years. Who benefited from certain misunderstandings? Who avoided discomfort by accepting the simplest explanation? Who unconsciously relied on me to absorb ambiguity so they wouldn't have to? And I learned something about myself too. I wasn't angry, I wasn't plotting, I wasn't waiting for a dramatic reveal. I was preparing, not to expose anyone, but to protect my reality if it was ever challenged again. There's a difference. Preparation doesn't require urgency, it requires consistency. I kept my tone neutral, my interactions are polite. My distance is unremarkable. I didn't withdraw completely, that would have raised questions. I simply stopped offering excess. And because I had always given more than necessary, the reduction felt like an absence. My sibling grew more confident, more assertive. Their stories became bolder. They spoke as if consensus had already been reached, even when I hadn't been consulted at all. I let it happen, because every unchallenged exaggeration deepens the eventual contrast with the truth. I don't say that with satisfaction, just accuracy. People assume preparation looks like control, like manipulation, like some grand strategy unfolding behind the scenes. It doesn't. Most of the time, it looks like restraint. It looks like letting someone talk, letting assumptions solidify, letting patterns repeat long enough that they can no longer be explained away as misunderstandings. What they never noticed was that I wasn't disengaged. I was aligning my actions with my values, aligning my understanding with evidence rather than emotion, aligning my future choices with the reality I was observing, not the one I wished existed. And quietly, without anyone realizing it, I stopped being the person whose truth could be overwritten. Because I finally had something stronger than my word. I had the record. The reveal didn't come with adrenaline. There was no moment where I leaned back in my chair and thought, so this is it? No rush, no triumph, no sense of being proven right. It came quietly, almost mundanely, the way truth often does when it isn't trying to impress anyone. I was reviewing old files one evening, not for any specific reason, just maintenance. The kind of slow, careful sorting that happens when you finally trust yourself enough to look closely. And then I noticed something I hadn't been looking for. A timeline, not written out, but implied. Messages from my sibling saved months apart, describing the same event differently. An email was forwarded to my parents that omitted a key detail I had documented elsewhere. A date that had shifted forward in one retelling, backward in another. Small things, individually forgettable, together unmistakable. I laid everything out, digitally, side by side, not to build a case, just to see it clearly. And what I saw wasn't chaos, it was consistency, not in facts and in direction. Every version of the story bent the same way. Responsibility slid off my sibling and settled gently onto me. Confusion resolved itself into my supposed oversight. Their emotional response was centered. My actions were minimized, reframed, or quietly reinterpreted. It wasn't one lie. It was a pattern of narrative gravity, and for the first time, I could see exactly how it had worked. I felt something then, not anger, but a deep, steady calm, because ambiguity had been my enemy for years, and ambiguity was gone. I realized that if anyone ever slowed down long enough to look, really look, the contradictions would speak for themselves. I wouldn't need to convince anyone. I wouldn't need to explain tone or intention or nuance. The truth was procedural. It lived in timestamps, in phrasing, in what was said, and what was consistently left out. I closed my laptop and sat there for a long time, not planning, not rehearsing, just absorbing what this meant, because knowing the truth privately is different from having it acknowledged publicly. One gives you clarity, the other tempts you toward urgency. And urgency was the one thing I refused to feel. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found, not my parents, not my sibling, not friends. This wasn't something to share prematurely. Once exposed, it couldn't be unseen, and it couldn't be recontained. I understood that instinctively, so I let it sit. Days passed, then weeks, and in that time, something important happened. My sense of self stabilized. For the first time in years, I wasn't wondering whether I had misremembered, whether I had been unfair, whether I had missed something obvious that everyone else could see. I hadn't. That certainty didn't make me louder. It made me precise. I started thinking not in terms of if the truth mattered, but when and how it would intersect with reality on its own terms. Because narratives built on distortion are fragile. They require maintenance. They depend on silence from the people they misrepresent. And I had already withdrawn that support. I didn't feel vindictive. I didn't want to humiliate anyone. I didn't even want an apology. What I wanted was alignment. I wanted the version of me that existed in my parents' minds to either reconcile with reality or be exposed as incompatible with it. And I knew now that I didn't need to force that reckoning. All I needed was patience, because the truth, once documented, doesn't need to chase anyone. It waits. Knowing the truth didn't tell me what to do with it. That was the part no one talks about. There's a moment, once clarity arrives, where action feels both necessary and dangerous, where every option carries weight. Not just consequences, but meaning. And I stood there for a long time, considering paths that all led somewhere irreversible. I could confront my sibling, lay everything out, point out inconsistencies, ask them to explain the gaps, demand accountability, but I knew how that would go. Emotion would take over. The conversation would become about tone, not facts, about intent, not outcome, about how hurt they felt being questioned. The story would shift again, not because the evidence was weak, but because the dynamic was familiar. I could go to my parents, present the documentation, walk them through the timeline, ask them to reconsider. That option was more tempting, but it came with its own risk, because once you ask someone to reevaluate a belief they've held for years, you're not just challenging a story. You're challenging their judgment, their choices. They have a sense of themselves as fair and perceptive. And people don't always thank you for that, especially not parents. I could also do nothing. Continue living quietly, let the distance remain, protect my peace, and accept the loss as permanent. That option felt clean, controlled, safe, but it also felt unfinished. Not because I needed validation, but because the consequences of the lie were still unfolding. Decisions were still being made with that narrative as a foundation. And as long as that foundation stood, it would continue shaping outcomes that affected me. There was a fourth option, One I hadn't considered until then. I could stop trying to correct the story and instead remove myself from its influence entirely. Not dramatically, not as punishment, strategically. I looked at my life and asked a different question. What choices am I making that are still compensating for a narrative that isn't true? The answer was uncomfortable. There were financial ties, shared responsibilities, informal arrangements that existed only because I was considered the reasonable one. Emotional labor I was still quietly providing, even from a distance. I realized that as long as I remained embedded in those systems, the story about me didn't need to be accurate. It just needed to be convenient. So I chose the option that didn't require anyone else's understanding. I chose to disengage structurally. That decision wasn't impulsive. It wasn't fueled by anger. It was slow, deliberate, and in its own way, compassionate. Because it gave everyone exactly what they already believed I was. Independent, capable, unaffected. I didn't announce this choice. I didn't frame it as a boundary conversation. I simply began making decisions that aligned with my reality instead of theirs. I untangled obligations. I declined roles that relied on my invisibility. I redirected resources. I simplified. Each step was small, reasonable, difficult to argue against without acknowledging the very assumptions no one wanted to examine. And as I did, I felt something settle inside me. Relief. Not because things were getting easier, they weren't yet, but because I was no longer waiting for permission to be accurate. I wasn't asking to be believed. I was acting as if I already was. That was the irreversible choice. Once you stop orienting your life around being misunderstood, you can't go back to negotiating your truth for comfort. And I didn't know it then. But that decision set everything else in motion. Moving in silence doesn't look like secrecy. It looks like paperwork, calendars, polite emails, small decisions that don't announce themselves as turning points, but are. Once I made the decision to disengage structurally, I stopped explaining my reasoning to people who weren't asking in good faith. I also stopped waiting for reactions before taking action. I began with the practical ties. There were shared financial arrangements that had existed out of convenience, expenses I covered because it was easier, contributions that were assumed rather than discussed. I adjusted them methodically, not abruptly, just clearly. I won't be able to continue covering that after this month. I'm restructuring my budget. I need to focus on my own priorities right now. Each statement was true. None of them were confrontational. There were also emotional roles I quietly stepped out of. I stopped mediating between my parents and my sibling. When one complained about the other, I listened briefly, then redirected. You might want to talk to them directly about that. At first, this was met with confusion, then mild irritation, then silence, which told me how much unseen labor I'd been performing. I didn't document these changes for leverage. I documented them for continuity, to ensure that if the story shifted later, I would remember the sequence as it happened. Because when you move in silence, people often reinterpret your actions retroactively. I was careful, not manipulative, careful. I made sure every decision could stand on its own merit, that nothing I did required anyone else to be wrong for it to make sense. That was important. I wasn't trying to win. I was trying to exit a system that depended on me being misunderstood. During this time, my parents didn't reach out much. When they did, the conversations were polite, surface level, almost formal. They assumed distance meant indifference. They were wrong, but that misunderstanding worked in my favor, because it allowed me to make choices without emotional interference. My sibling noticed the changes more quickly. They asked why I wasn't as available, why I seemed checked out, why I wasn't stepping in anymore. I didn't argue. I'm just focusing on my own life right now, I said, which was, again, true. The silence unsettled them. People who are used to your presence as a stabilizing force often feel destabilized when it disappears, even if they never acknowledged its value before. Still, I didn't escalate. I continued living my life, building routines that didn't revolve around family expectations, strengthening my independence, financially, emotionally, logistically. And because none of this was dramatic, it was underestimated. No one thought to ask where it was leading. They thought it was a phase. They thought I'd eventually resume my role. What they didn't realize was that the system was already adjusting to my absence, and in doing so, revealing its weaknesses. Without me smoothing things over, conflicts lingered longer. Without my compensating, responsibilities became visible. Without me quietly fixing things, mistakes had to be owned. I didn't cause those consequences. I simply stopped preventing them. That's what moving in silence really is. Not hiding your intentions, but refusing to interfere with reality. And reality, once left to operate without your labor, tends to speak for itself. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They arrived as inconveniences, small delays, missed expectations, awkward pauses where someone assumed I would step in, and no one did. At first, these moments were brushed off, explained away as bad timing, stress, circumstances. But over time, they began to accumulate. And accumulation has a way of demanding attention. My parents started noticing that things felt harder. Arrangements that used to just work now require follow-up. Miscommunications lingered longer. Tension that I once quietly diffused began to surface. Unresolved, uncomfortable, exposed. They didn't connect this to me directly, not yet. Instead, they expressed vague frustration. "Everything feels more complicated lately," my mother said once, during a brief phone call. "People are just busy," I replied, which was true. But it wasn't the whole truth. My sibling felt the shift more acutely. Without my steady presence to soften edges, their emotional responses carried more weight and less insulation. When they became upset, there was no buffer, no translator. No one is quietly reframing their words into something easier to receive. That made others uncomfortable. I began to hear about situations secondhand. Complaints that used to be filtered now arrive raw. Stories that once had a clear villain became messier, less coherent. And slowly, subtly, the narrative started to strain under its own weight. It wasn't that people suddenly doubted my sibling. It was then that they began to notice patterns, inconsistencies, overreactions, shifting explanations. Not enough to confront, just enough to feel unsettled. My parents, in particular, seemed tired. Tired of mediating, tired of absorbing emotional intensity, tired of feeling like they were constantly managing fallout. They didn't say this explicitly, but I could hear it in their voices. In the shorter calls, there are longer pauses before responding. For the first time, they weren't protected by my calm. And that absence was doing something important. It was allowing reality to present itself without translation. I didn't step in when they seemed overwhelmed. I didn't offer solutions. I let the discomfort exist. That wasn't cruelty, it was a restraint. Because stepping in now would have restored the illusion that everything was fine. And it wasn't. I noticed that when my name came up, it did so differently, less confidently. Instead of "Evelyn wouldn't mind," it became "Evelyn's been busy lately." Instead of "she understands," it became "I'm not sure what she thinks." Uncertainty had entered the narrative. And uncertainty is dangerous to stories built on assumptions. My sibling reacted by becoming more insistent, more expressive. Their explanations grew longer. Their frustration is more visible, which only accelerated the shift. Because emotional intensity, when repeated without resolution, stops being persuasive. It starts being exhausting. My parents began asking questions they hadn't asked before, not about the past, but about logistics, responsibilities, boundaries. "What are you planning to do long-term?" my father asked me once. It was a neutral question, but it carried something new, awareness. They were realizing that the version of me they'd been operating with, the endlessly available one, no longer applied, and they hadn't been consulted. That realization was destabilizing, not because I'd done anything wrong, but because it forced them to confront a truth they hadn't examined. I had been holding more than they realized. And now I wasn't. The consequences were not explosive. They were cumulative, and once set in motion, they didn't require my involvement to continue. The first attempt to fix things came swiftly. It didn't sound like an apology. It didn't acknowledge anything specific. It came disguised as concern. My mother called one evening and asked, "Is everything okay with you?" It was a simple question, one she hadn't asked in a long time. I paused before answering, not to calculate, but to listen to what was underneath it. I could hear the strain in her voice, the uncertainty, the subtle discomfort of someone realizing that a familiar dynamic no longer functions, but not yet understanding why. "I'm fine," I said, which was true. She hesitated, then added, "You've just seemed distant. Not hurt, not excluded, distant. Distance is easier to address than cause." "I've been focusing on my own life more," I replied. "It's been good for me." She didn't argue, she didn't press, but something shifted in her tone. A quiet recalibration. After that, the messages increased. Casual check-ins, invitations are framed as open-ended, a noticeable effort to sound accommodating. My father followed a different approach. He was more direct. "We may not have handled everything perfectly," he said during a rare conversation. "Families make mistakes." It was an almost admission, carefully worded, abstract enough to avoid specifics. Years ago, that might have been enough. Now it wasn't, because I could hear what wasn't being said. No mention of the lie, no acknowledgement of the narrative, no curiosity about my experience. They weren't trying to understand what had happened. They were trying to restore equilibrium. An equilibrium built on distortion doesn't hold. My sibling, sensing the shift, grew anxious. They reached out more frequently, asked questions that circled rather than landed, made comments about how things used to be, about how close we all were. They never addressed the past directly. Instead, they framed the present as the problem. I listened, calmly, briefly, and I realized something crucial. The moment for repair had passed. Not because I was unwilling, but because repair requires truth, and truth requires a willingness to sit with discomfort. They wanted resolution without reckoning, connection without accountability, stability without revision. And that wasn't possible anymore. I didn't reject them. I didn't accuse. I didn't lay out evidence or timelines. I simply didn't step forward to close the gap they refused to name. There's a difference between forgiveness and erasure, between moving on and pretending nothing happened. What they were offering wasn't a repair. It was reset. And resets only work when the original fault is acknowledged. The hardest part wasn't saying no. I realized I didn't need to say anything at all. Their efforts came too late. Not in time, but in depth. They were responding to consequences, not causes. And I wasn't interested in going back to a version of myself that existed to prevent discomfort rather than live truthfully. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sad. Not for what was lost, but for what had never been protected in the first place. That's when I knew the story was approaching its inevitable moment, not a dramatic confrontation. A quiet one. The confrontation didn't happen because I demanded it. It happened because silence eventually creates its own pressure. My parents asked to meet, not urgently, not emotionally, just a suggestion, offered carefully, as if they were testing the ground beneath their feet. I agreed. We sat at a small table in a quiet cafe, neutral territory, no home field advantage, no familiar rooms filled with old dynamics. They looked older than I remembered, tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. For a few minutes, we talked about ordinary things: work, weather, mutual acquaintances, the way people do when they're circling something they don't know how to enter. Then my father said, "We feel like we lost you." I didn't respond immediately, not because I was bracing myself, but because I wanted to answer accurately. "You didn't lose me," I said. "You just stopped knowing where I was." My mother frowned slightly. "We never meant to push you away." "I know," I said. That surprised them. I didn't say it to comfort them. I said it because it was true. Intent had never been the issue. Impact had. There was a pause. Then my mother asked quietly, "Did we do something wrong?" That was the moment, not the dramatic one, the honest one. "Yes," I said calmly, "but not in the way you think." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list grievances. I didn't pull out documentation or timelines. I spoke slowly, precisely. I told them how certain stories had been accepted without question, how my silence had been interpreted as agreement, how decisions had been made about me rather than with me. I didn't say my sibling's name at first. I described patterns instead, how emotional certainty had outweighed consistency, how restraint had been mistaken for resilience, how my role had become so fixed that no one noticed when it stopped fitting. They listened, really listened, and then my father asked the question he'd been avoiding. "Are you saying your sibling lied?" I held his gaze. "I'm saying the truth wasn't checked," I replied, and that had consequences. The room went quiet. My mother's eyes filled, not with tears, but with recognition, the kind that arrives when something unspoken finally has a shape. "We thought you would tell us if something was wrong," she said. "I did," I replied gently, just not loudly. I didn't accuse them of choosing sides. I didn't frame myself as a victim. I told them what it had cost me to always be the reasonable one, to absorb doubt without protest, to be edited out of my own story. And then I said the thing I'd practiced, not in words, but in conviction. "I'm not here to punish anyone. I'm here to be accurate." They didn't argue. They didn't interrupt. They didn't defend. That's how I knew it had landed. Accuracy is hard to fight. It doesn't provoke. It doesn't escalate. It simply stands. When we parted, there were no promises, no dramatic reconciliations, no declarations of change, just a shared understanding that something real had been named, and that it couldn't be unnamed. That was enough. Who I am now is not a reaction to what happened. That's important. I didn't rebuild myself in opposition to my family or in defiance of the past. I didn't harden. I didn't retreat into bitterness. I didn't replace silence with noise. I clarified. The person I am now is quieter, but not smaller, more selective, but not closed. I no longer confuse restraint with responsibility or endurance with love. After that conversation, things didn't magically repair themselves. Some habits softened, some assumptions dissolved slowly, others remained exposed but stubborn. And I let them, because growth doesn't require consensus. I redefined my relationship with my parents first. Not through rules, but through consistency. I stopped anticipating their needs. I stopped filling emotional gaps. I responded, but I didn't manage. At first, that made them uncertain. They asked more questions, checked in awkwardly, sometimes overcorrected. I didn't reassure them unnecessarily. I let them learn me again or not. With my sibling, the distance remained wider, civil, polite, undefined. And that was intentional, not as punishment, but as protection. I no longer felt the urge to explain myself to someone who had never asked to understand. I didn't need to prove anything. The narrative they once controlled had lost its leverage over my life. That was enough. Externally, my life became simpler. Internally, it became steadier. I made decisions without rehearsing how they'd be received. I spoke when I meant something, and stayed quiet when I didn't. I stopped offering access as proof of love. The most surprising change was this. I stopped being afraid of being misunderstood, because I finally understood myself. I knew what was true, not abstractly, but concretely, and that made external misinterpretation survivable. I no longer waited for recognition to validate my experience. I no longer needed acknowledgement to move forward. That doesn't mean I stopped caring. It means I stopped centering my life around people who had once centered their comfort around my silence. There's a calm that comes with that kind of alignment. Not relief, solidity. I still value honesty, still value family, still value empathy, but I value accuracy more. Accuracy in how I'm treated, in how I'm spoken about, in how my absence or presence is interpreted. And when accuracy isn't possible, I don't argue. I step back. That's who I am now. Not the family villain, not the silent absorber, not the misunderstood one waiting to be seen. Just someone who knows when to speak. And when silence is no longer an obligation, but a choice. There's a particular kind of harm that doesn't leave bruises. It comes from being misrepresented by people who believe they're being fair, from having your quiet nature mistaken for agreement, from watching a version of you take shape in other people's minds, and realizing you were never asked whether it was accurate. For a long time, I believed that if I stayed calm enough, reasonable enough, consistent enough, the truth would eventually surface on its own. What I learned is more precise than that. Truth doesn't surface because someone deserves it. It surfaces when it's no longer being protected by silence. The lie that shaped my family's perception of me didn't survive because it was clever. It survived because I absorbed its consequences without protest, because I compensated for the confusion it caused, because I made myself useful in ways that prevented anyone from having to look closely. When I stopped doing that, not angrily, not dramatically, the story lost its foundation. No shouting was required, no humiliation, no revenge, just alignment. And that alignment changed everything. My parents didn't wake up one day and suddenly understand. They felt the absence first. They felt the strain. They felt the confusion of a system that no longer worked the way it used to. Only then were they able to hear what had been quietly true all along. The hardest part wasn't being cut off. I realized how long I'd been available to be misunderstood. And the most important lesson wasn't about my family at all. It was about me. I learned that silence can be a refuge, but it can also be a contract. One that teaches people what they can get away with. One that defines your role before you ever consent to it. Breaking that contract doesn't require confrontation. It requires clarity. If there's one thing I hope this story leaves you with, it's this. You don't owe anyone access to you in exchange for peace. You don't owe anyone your silence to preserve their comfort. And you don't need to prove the truth to people who benefit from not seeing it. Sometimes the most powerful shift happens when you stop explaining and start living in a way that no longer supports the lie. If you've ever been misunderstood by your family, if you've ever been labeled the problem simply because you didn't fight back, if you've ever wondered whether staying quiet was actually costing you more than speaking up, I'd really like to hear from you. What did you do, or what are you still deciding to do, when the truth was quiet and the cost of silence became too high?